Module 7, we're going to introduce charting with charting basics. And in this module, I'm going to start by talking about the features of charts and the components that make up charts in their most basic form. So you're going to learn about the different objects that comprise charts and the properties of those objects. Now there's a lot to charting, and there's a lot you can do with charting and reporting services, which is why we're just going to lay the groundwork and talk about some of these foundational objects and properties in this module. We'll also talk about chart type selection. There are a lot of different kinds of charts, and different charts are suitable for different business purposes. We'll talk about some of those decision points and help you get started by choosing the right kind of chart for the type of data that you'll be visualizing and the business need that your users have. In the first demonstration, I'll review designing chart features, and I'll show you some very useful techniques for creating useful charts that are commonly used in business. After that, we'll go a little bit deeper and talk about chart enhancement properties and techniques. Now, you're going to start using some of the skills that you've previously developed, mainly grouping and expressions, and that will take us to the second demonstration, working with enhanced chart properties, where we'll apply those expressions and talk about some of the more advanced properties that we use in charts. Chart basic concepts. So these are just the first four objects and concepts that are important to understand. A series value is the actual aggregate value that we visualize in the chart. In this case, this area chart, which is arranged horizontally, categorized by calendar year and month, is going to have the sum of sales amount plotted across each of the months. That takes us to the category group. Now, this particular chart actually has two different category groups. It's grouped first by the year and then subgrouped by the month, which is why we see the little set brackets for the years down there at the bottom. In this chart, the series group causes each of the areas to be rendered multiple times, and you can see in the legend where we have four different product category values that are plotted within the same area chart. An axis is the place where the scale values show up. So we have a vertical axis in this area chart that shows us the actual sales amount in a scale of 0 to 5,000. So those numbers are formatted. We have an axis title that tells us that that's the sales amount. And then the horizontal axis relates to the category group and shows us, first of all, that there's an axis title that tells us that that's the order, year, and month. And then we actually see the year and month values. All of the objects that comprise charts are grouped into collections. So the chart object itself has these collections of objects: chart areas, category groups, series groups, legends, and custom color palette. And then you can see that there's a hierarchy of objects underneath that. Now we'll explore a lot of these objects as we get into more advanced charting, but this is actually a diagram from my my RocksPress Professional Series book that shows how these objects in the hierarchy on the left relate to a line chart. Charts have over 200 properties. Now we're going to review each and every one of these properties. No, I'm kidding. I'm going to tell you which properties are most important for you to use and show you examples of the properties that you should pay attention to. There are 60 unique chart types in reporting services. Now, just because there are a lot of chart types doesn't mean that you should use them all. And some of these types of charts are variations of other chart types with certain properties set and visual enhancements and things that we might call eye candy, like 3D effects. These are the most common chart types that I typically use in business reports. So there are just a few. And you can really boil these down as column charts, line charts, circular charts or special case charts you see over on the right, bar charts, and area charts. Now, we do see some of the newer shape charts that were introduced in SQL Server 2016. There in the shape chart collection over on the right side, we see the tree map and the sunburst chart. We'll take a look at those a little later on. These are some additional charts that I do commonly use, but typically only in special cases. The funnel chart, which is commonly used in a sales pipeline or CRM application. The banded area charts are kind of special purpose types of area charts. The box plots are commonly used for statistical purposes to show quartiling. And then the scatter and bubble charts are also fairly special purpose, but still commonly used and quite popular. Charting and data visualization is very much a fashionable practice. So some ideas that seemed like a good idea at the time that we've seen in history may have been very normal at the time that these styles were fashionable. The same thing is true with charting. At one time, it was very common for charts to use 3D and shadow effects, to have gradient fills and heavy borders, and that's what I would call eye candy today. Not really so popular and not used so much anymore. I think that now that the industry has seen what we can do visually with computers, we're really more interested in presenting data in a useful manner rather than showing off how pretty we can make things. Matching the visual to the data and use case. I'll provide some simple guidance here that will help simplify this as much as possible. There are a few different categories of chart usages. One is segmentation. In a segmented presentation, each of the categories, their product names that you see in the bottom legend, are unrelated. Data doesn't flow from one to the other. They're simply different buckets to aggregate data against. A time series or continuous series report also groups and aggregates data, but that data logically flows from one category point to another. Time is the best example, but there are other examples where data moves from day to day or from month to month or from year to year, and so the order is important, and typically it makes sense to use something like a line or an area, but it may also be appropriate to use a bubble, which we see in the lower right-hand corner, or even a column or a bar. Measure to target. So the visual here, the bullet graph, has actually three different important elements. One is the maximum, so the end of the scale has some kind of significance. The bar is our target or goal. That's what we're measuring against. You can see that two of these bars are a kind of a tomato red color, which indicates that that actual value has not reached its target. And in a business context, that might mean that it's bad news. Maybe we've fallen short of some kind of a sales goal. The blue or teal colors show that the actual value has exceeded its target. So this is a form of a key performance indicator based on some kind of a category. Contribution to a whole. Now this is a variation of the segmentation, or it could be variation of a time series. You can see that we actually have weeks on the vertical axis there, but these are stacked bar charts. Stacked charts have pros and cons. Pros in that you're able to see the proportion of one value to another within its category value. Cons in that it may be difficult to compare each of the series grouped values. So for example, the red and the orange values are difficult to compare from week to week, but the stacked bar shows us the contribution to the total. Deviations and outliers. So this is a special case type of report. I'm just using this as an example of a lot of different special purpose reports. In this case, the box plot is actually used for statistical purposes to show us how a large volume of values fit into a quartile map. Geographic analysis. When geography is involved, it may be appropriate to display aggregated and comparative information on a map. In this case, the size of the bubbles shows us a relative value, and the color of those bubbles shows us some kind of a category for comparison. Well, you've already seen some use cases for expressions, and expressions are used in charts. They can be simple or complex, and I'll show you several examples. Here, the series value is a simple aggregate expression. We're always going to aggregate in a chart. In this case, we're taking the sum of quantity across the category groups. The category groups are based on expressions. In this example, I have two category groups. First, the calendar year. There you see a simple field expression, and then the month, yet another simple field expression to create this simple line chart. Let's take a look at some common chart properties. These are the properties to pay attention to first as you're learning about charting. First is the axis scale format. You'll always want to format your axis scales so that numbers are readable and legible. If you have very large numbers, then you have the option to show values in thousands, millions, billions. So essentially it divides the number and then shows it in abbreviated form. In each case, you'll want to make sure that you add an axis title to let the reader know what the scale is and how it's being measured. Axis interval. By default, the interval property for an axis scale is set to auto, which means that it's going to automatically show as many values as it can without crowding the axis scale. It's very common to set this interval to 1 so that it always shows one value per grouping. In this case, we want to see every month. We also want to make sure that the chart is appropriately sized so that those labels don't crowd each other, and that the font sizes are set so that they're readable. Category group properties. So there are several properties, much like groups in a table or a matrix, where we're grouping by a field, and then we may want to sort by a different field than the one we're grouping by. You can set the sort order in ascending or descending order, or in special cases, you may want to both group and sort on something other than just a simple field expression, like, let's say, a calculation or the concatenation of multiple fields. To get us started with chart reporting, I'm going to start with a report with a couple of tables. Now, so far we've been using tables and matrices to present information. You can see that that's an effective way to present information in a way that users can understand it. But it is kind of bland, and sometimes it doesn't communicate information so that it can be read conveniently at a glance. And that's really what visual reporting is all about. So before we get into this report, I do want to point out a couple of things very quickly. And I want to start with the parameters and the data set that we'll be using. So first of all, I do have a data set called StateProvList, which is just a very simple data set that returns a list of states. And that's going to drive my state province parameter. The state province parameter is a multi-select parameter, and that just means that the user can actually select more than one item from a list. So when you check that box to make it a multi-select parameter, then the user can do this. They can select and deselect anything that they like, in addition to selecting all and deselecting all. Within my main query called Order Details by Customer, here you can see that I am using a view called VW Order Details by Customer, and there's a where clause. So rather than saying where the state province field is equal to the state province parameter, I'm using the tsql in function, and that facilitates the use of a multi-select parameter. I'm also using the between operator to say where the order date key, which is a date type column, is between at date from and at date to parameters. All right, let's take a quick look at this report. You'll also see that because by default I've selected several different states, that you see all of those selected states in this text box. And you can investigate that technique on your own. Now, just to keep things nice and simple, I'm actually going to hide that text box. That'll give me a little more room. And I want to move both of these tables down. Now, before I do that, I have two tables. The first has a row group based on the month. And of course, months are always in logical date order, January, February, March, etc., with the quantity and total excluding tax numeric columns. And then I have another table with the buying group. There is no particular order to a buying group. They're just three different buying groups with an aggregation of the total excluding tax. So we're going to talk about the best way to visualize the data in both of these tables. So the first thing I'm going to do is select both of those tables and just move them down out of the way. Just so I have them for reference, I want some white space here where I can create some charts. So I'll go ahead and start with a new chart. I'm going to insert a chart right here in place of that first table. And I'm just going to select the first chart type. You can see that there are lots of different types of charts. Just because there are a lot of different choices doesn't mean that you should use them all. There really are just a few core charts that typically make sense to use for most purposes. But then there are some special purpose charts that are very nice and can be used under the right conditions. But I'm just going to choose this standard column chart and we'll click OK. I'll go ahead and make that as big as the table was and make my report body just a little bit bigger, anticipating the other chart that I'm going to add. Now when I click again on the chart, that opens this chart data window. Now I can drag and drop from the data set fields into any of these three different field lists, or I can use these big green plus signs right here. Now, since I have two data sets, if I were to click the plus sign, I'll be prompted for the data set first. So there's the data source, then the data set, and you can see that I'm actually leaving the viewable area on my screen since I'm sharing a portion of my screen with you. But I'll go ahead and choose the quantity. You can see that that adds that value. This is what's called a series value. If you click on this down arrow, you'll see that I can get to the series properties. That tells me what kind of object that is, as opposed to a category group or a series group. Now I can do the same thing here. Since I've already selected a field from my data set, my chart now is bound to the data set. So if I click on this plus sign, you'll see that I just get a list of fields. That's because I already set the data set name property of the chart by selecting the previous field. And we want to group this by month. We'll go ahead and just choose month. Well, and that's all of the fields that I need to select in order to create a chart. Move that back up. And I'm going to preview the report. And though I do get data, and I can see that the chart is giving me some information, it's not really formatted very well. It needs to be cleaned up. So a few things that I need to take care of. One is that the vertical axis is unformatted. I know that that's quantity, but I just see some big numbers there with lots of zeros that are hard to read. And I can also see that I don't have all of my months, and the months that I can see aren't in the right order. And that's the problem we've seen before, where the months automatically are going to be sorted in alphabetical order. So I need to go back to Design View and fix both of those problems. Actually, let's say all three of those problems. Formatting of the vertical axis, getting all of the months listed, and then the order of the months. So we'll go back to Design View, and each of these areas of the chart is a separate object that I can select. I click once to select the chart, click again, and that selects that object. What kind of object is that? I'll right click, and I can see that that's the vertical axis. And I can change the vertical axis properties, which opens up a window. And if we go to the number page, you can see that I can format that as a number. And because these are relatively big numbers, let's go ahead and format them as millions. And I'm going to leave this as 2 decimal positions, even though these are are actually whole numbers. If I show them as millions, then this will show me the fractions of those numbers. So I'll go ahead and use the thousand separator as well. Now, whenever I show a fractional version of a number, so show it as thousands or millions or billions, you always want to let the user know that they're not actually looking at the right number. So we need to right-click and show the axis title. And in the axis title, I'm going to say millions. All right, well, that's item number one. Now I'll right-click on the horizontal axis, and there are two things that I want to do. One, I want to change the interval from auto, which means that it's going to put as many labels as it can within the available space, to 1, where it's going to label each series grouped value. And so that will make sure that every month has a label, whether there's room for it or not. Now, the chart's actually pretty smart about rotating text and resizing text so that it fits as well as it can. And I know from experience that I have plenty of room here. Let's click OK there. Then I'll also go to the properties of the actual month category group. And like we've done before, I'm going to go to the sorting page, and rather than sorting on the month, we'll sort on the calendar month number. Click on that. We'll go ahead and run the report again. And now I can see that I have my quantity in millions. These are fractions of millions, so that works. I can tell you that that's 0.6 million. Maybe it would make more sense to show that as thousands rather than millions, but that works for me. I see that the months are one on each column, so that's working, and the months are in the right order. So I'm pretty satisfied with this chart just for showing the quantity. Now we'll come back to adding a second series so that we can show the total excluding tax field. But is this the right type of chart to use? Now, I would argue that this is probably a good selection. There's nothing wrong with using a column chart for a series of values like this. But the fact that this is in fact a series, that the value changes from January to February, then it changes from February to March, suggests that that data should flow, and I may want to visualize it as it moves from one month to the other. So let's go back to the design view. We'll go ahead and click on the chart, and if I right-click on my series value, you can see that I can actually change the chart type. So rather than using a column chart, I can go down to a line chart. I've got a few options here. I can use straight lines, smooth lines, stepped lines. The 3D effects are really not so much in vogue right now, so we tend not to use them so much, but I'm going to go ahead and use a line with markers. And I can just go ahead and accept the defaults, but there's one thing that I do want to change, and that is that the default is a 1-point line. That's awfully small for this chart. So I'm going to right-click on that line, go to Series Properties, and we'll go to the border, and we'll bump that up to a 2-point line. Let's go ahead and run it. And I'm happy with that. So again, I can see that the values move over time, and I can see that there's a nice trend that tells me how things are progressing. For a user, that suggests that things are going up and down and moving in a certain direction. So I think that's a very appropriate visual, though I think the column chart was still an acceptable way to visualize this data. Now, let's move to this second table. So I'm going to go ahead and just repeat the same steps as before. Go ahead and insert a chart. I'll place that right here. And since we had chosen the line chart with markers before, let's go ahead and choose that. I'll just make that wide enough. And I'm actually going to drag and drop. So I'll go ahead and just drag the total excluding tax field into the values. And since I've already chosen something from that data set when I use this list, it's just going to show me the fields now. We're going to go ahead and group this using the bind group. Just as I did before, I'll right click on the line, go to the series properties, we'll change the border so that it's 2 points. And we'll go ahead and format this just as I did before. Since these are currency values and they are larger numbers than the quantity, we'll go ahead and just choose currency, leave it at 2 decimal positions. I'll use a thousand separator and show these as millions. And just like I did before, I'll go ahead and add the axis title and say millions. All right, let's go ahead and run that. So we get a chart much like we did before. There are fewer values here. There are only 2 buying groups plus this group called NA. So my question is a line an appropriate way to visualize this data where I have 3 distinct categories of buying groups? The answer to that question is no, it's not. Data does not flow from one buying group to another. That is a categoric measurement. These are just different buckets, and they're really not related to each other. So that's not an appropriate visual to use. This is typically the way that I would get to this property. I change the chart type, and I'll change that back to a column. Let's go ahead and view that again. And I think that's a very appropriate way to visualize this data. Now you've seen how to work with some of the most basic properties and capabilities of charts. Now we're going to look at some slightly more advanced features that we'll call chart enhancement properties. So I'm just going to review some properties that may be useful for you beyond just basic charting, and then I'll show you some specific examples. Text angle and rotation. If you have values on a category axis that are either numerous or very long strings, then you have the ability to change the angle of the text, rotate that text. Of course, you can always change font sizes and manipulate the text so that it fits a little bit easier. In larger charts, it may make sense to show grid lines. We have both major grid lines and minor grid lines. Typically, the minor grid lines are more subtle, but this just allows the user to be able to see the scale of values across the entire chart. And I'll show you an example of this. Data labels allow you to actually label each individual aggregated data point. And tooltips can be used either with or in lieu of data labels so that when the user hovers over an area of the chart, they can see more specific information. Tooltips utilize expressions, and here's an example of an expression that I might use and will use in the demonstration I'm going to show you here pretty soon. Markers can be used in line or area charts so that you have a specific reference point for a specific category value across that trend line. Borderline widths, typically you're going to make these bold in smaller charts so that the chart is easier to read, gives you a little more control. And the border and fill colors, depending on whether it's a line chart or something like a column or a bar chart, border and fill colors are automatically set according to a color palette. So by default, the colors will cycle through one of 16 colors in the palette. You can choose from a number of palettes within the designer. You can create your own palettes, or we can set those colors explicitly using properties. You can change the color of either the border or the fill color, and we can do this dynamically using an expression as well. And here's an example similar to what I'm going to show you in the upcoming demonstration, where we can change the color of columns or bars in a chart or lines in a chart depending on whether that is a value that's under or over a threshold. We can show a legend, and typically when you have a series group, that will generate additional values that show up in the legend. You can decide what values show in the legend. You can use expressions for that, or you can move the legend around to different parts of the chart. So here's an example of an enhanced column chart. You can see that I've used an expression on the fill color of the columns so that the lower values are red, the larger values are blue. Again, based on an expression, you have complete control over this. Here's an example of a tooltip and the data labels, which show up at the end of each of the bars. Data labels work great when you have a lot of room, but when the chart may be crowded, then they can get very cluttered. And you see examples of that in October and November when things started getting a little crowded and it was difficult to see those numbers. And so automatically the chart will show arrows and callouts. So here's an example of the major and minor grid lines that are visible in this chart. You see the major grid lines are a solid line. The minor grid lines in this view are a dotted line. You have control over all of those properties. There's the tooltip. I've included the month in this tooltip, as well as the quantity, and then the data labels. You see that I've actually used an expression to abbreviate the quantity value as thousands, and then I put a lowercase k at the end to let the user know that that was in thousands. And then the fill color, which I mentioned earlier, which I programmatically used an expression to set it to either blue or red, depending on its value. All right, well, let's take a look at a demonstration now. In the previous demonstration, we left off with this report, two charts that essentially were created in the place of these two tables. Let's reduce this down to one chart now. I'll remove this chart. I'll go ahead and remove the tables as well. I'm pressing delete, choosing the table, pressing delete, and I'll resize this chart. Earlier, I had abbreviated the values shown on the axis scale by showing the numbers as millions. I'm going to change that now that the chart is larger. I can show the actual values. So I'll go ahead and hide the axis title and go back to the vertical axis properties. And we'll change this back to showing the entire number, not by millions. There's no reason to use two decimal places now because quantity is a whole number, so we'll reduce that down to 0 decimals. We're using the automatic major axis scale lines. We can also turn on the minor axis scale lines. Now you'll find properties that let you control just about anything that you want. You can change the granularity of these scale lines. You can change how many values are actually shown. I'm not going to go into all of those properties, but I'll show you some of the most significant properties that we typically use. I'm going to turn on minor grid lines. You can see that by default that uses dotted lines where the major grid lines are solid lines. We could change the color and the width of all of those lines as well. The next thing that I'll do is I'll turn on data labels. So if I right click on the line, I can show data labels. Now these need to be formatted separately from the axis scales. And so if I right click here, I can go to the series label properties. Before I do that, I want to point out that when we get into more advanced report design, it might make more sense to use the properties window than the right click property dialogues. So if you turn on the properties window on the view ribbon, you can see all of the properties for the selected object. And if I right click and choose series label properties, the properties shown in this window are going to be redundant with the properties shown here. Generally speaking, all of the properties are available in the properties window, and then selected properties are available through the dialog. Now, I'm just interested in formatting, so I can go to the number page. I'll go to number, and we can go ahead and do the same thing that we did on the axis scale, reduce the decimal places to 0, and use a 1000 separator. Now let's see how that looks. It's really easy for charts to get overly cluttered, especially when you design them against a sample set of data and then use more data in production. So always test your charts with production volumes of data. So this may or may not be ideal. Perhaps we don't need to see the numbers with this level of granularity. One thing that I will commonly do is I'll reduce the the weight or the color of data labels using something that's less pronounced than the line itself. Here's an example of where I might do that. We'll go ahead and go to the series label properties. And in the font, rather than using black, I could use a medium gray. And I'll also go to the number. I'm going to go ahead and abbreviate that number. Now, if I do this, then I need to document that the number that the user is seeing is not the same number that they're seeing on the scale. So for example, now that I've reduced these numbers down to millions, the user is going to have to understand that 0.51 means 510,000. So I would need to document that in the heading or with some kind of labeling. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the data labels. Another way that I can make the most efficient use out of chart space without cluttering the chart is by using tooltips. So rather than turning on data labels, we can go to the series properties and use the tooltip property. What I like about the tooltip is that I can build a larger expression to show more information because I have a lot of space that I can work with. So here it would make sense to show the month and the value. So we'll go to the expression window, choose fields, double click the month, and then now I begin concatenating a string. Remember what you learned about using expressions. I can build compound strings and I can call Visual Basic.NET functions for calculations and formatting purposes. Now in this case, I actually want to build a multi-line string, and to do that, I'm going to use a Visual Basic constant for a carriage return line feed. There are a number of these, and they're all prefixed with VB. So this one is VBCRLF. That's a carriage return line feed, which is a character string 13 followed by a character string 10, but you don't need to know that as long as you're aware of these constants. So if I concatenate VBCRLF between two different values, it's going to put a line break in there so that I get a multi-line tooltip. Now I'm going to call the format function, and I'll pass in my quantity value. And then the second argument to the format function is going to be the actual format string passed inside double quotes. And I'm actually going to put QTY colon space. And I also want to make sure that I am aggregating correctly. And there's our tooltip. So now the user knows what month they're seeing, and they can see the exact quantity. As I mentioned, there are many properties that you have control over. So far we have grid lines on the vertical axis, but we don't have grid lines on the horizontal axis. I can turn on my major grid lines, which will be one per value. And then the user can see exactly which month they're on. The other thing that I can do is, so far I've just used the default colors. And so since I have the properties window open, we can see the color value for the line is set to automatic, but I can set that to any color explicitly. I could also set that to an expression. So let's go ahead and run that first of all, just so we can see what that looks like. For a large chart, I think this is appropriate, but let me show you how to use an expression for the color. So we'll go back, drop down the color, and use expression, and now I could say equals immediate if the sum of quantity is greater than let's say 250,000, then blue, else red. You want to be conservative with charts, make them as simple and sleek as possible, but it may be appropriate for larger charts to show more detail and more labeling so that the user can get more value from the chart rather than keeping things very simple and sleek.